First, I'm going to tell you what is my goal versus what is Carol's goal. And then I explain to you how one course is versus the other course. So Carol's goal is going to be focused mostly on what you typically see of teaching material in the PhD program, is using a deductive process. She's going to start with some assumptions, and based on the assumptions, she's going to show you, okay, what do we identify under those assumptions? And based on those assumptions, how can we estimate and how can we obtain confidence intervals? Oftentimes, confidence intervals would mean how do you estimate standard errors, but as you will see, it gets a little bit more complicated sometimes in partial identification, things like that. It's not necessarily perhaps the confidence interval you care about. Okay, but the key idea here is going to be always a deductive process, which is exactly the kind of way that you be thinking throughout your whole career as a student before grad school and as well as your first year of grad school. It's usually mostly a deductive process. But it turns out, as you see, if you want to transition from being a producer, from being a consumer of causal research to be a producer of causal research, you will see that there's a lot of hidden curriculum going on behind that. And that's where I'm going to focus on. And the hidden curriculum about causal research involves more like a feedback loop between induction and deduction, where I first might ask questions like, okay, given those assumptions, what do I identify? But which is purely deduction point. But then I realize, are these assumptions good enough? Are these assumptions credible? That's an induction process because I'm going to ask, what is the real world based on the data that I have here? Do I have enough evidence to believe in these assumptions? And as you will see, oftentimes you don't. Sometimes the assumption might be too strong. In that case, I will talk to you a lot into how you go about finding blind spots in your assumptions, how you go about testing those assumptions, but sometimes how you go about adjusting the causal question you want in the first place in order to actually ask a causal question that is at least doable. At least you can make an assumption that is credible and you can still obtain something valid. Does that make sense? That is exactly going to be the division of labor between Carol and I here. As you see, Carol is going to focus quite a bit on her notes and quite a bit of textbooks because the deduction process is by definition is being written, right? You see she has a lot of opinions about certain things, which is going to be valuable for you to find blind spots about what is currently not written in papers to give you the ability to contribute new research. And when I say new research, I don't mean necessarily for people that work in academia, but even for people that you want to find a better answer to a question in a company. For instance, you will see that if you follow papers straight away without being an independent thinker about it, you will see that there's a lot of meat left in that bone. You can actually go after something that's oftentimes a better answer to that question you want. Okay? So that is the first part. Now let's talk about a little bit about the two classes that we teach. This class, which is Econometrics, that's going to be a design-first approach. We're going to start from a very good design, usually something that relates to either a randomization or some kind of quasi-randomization. And we're going to say, first in the deductive approach, what can you identify based on that? But then, as you will see, not always the actual research turns out to be exactly as you idealized. And you see that there's a lot of details in the hidden curricula about sometimes the assumption is not perfect randomization. How do you go about testing that? Some people will be concerned about a particular assumption you're making, even under randomization. How do you go about testing that? How you go about finding out the blind spots of your test and so on. Does that make sense? That's usually what that class is going to be about. We're going to focus quite a bit about RCTs, randomized control trials. We're going to talk about instrumental variables quite a bit on instrumental variables, and we're going to talk about regression discontinuity design. Okay, that's because you all have taken classes already in diff and basic regression before. We're going to focus on the identification strategies that you have not focused on yet. Okay, these are the basic kind of identification strategy you should know. It should be in your toolkit for causal research. In the other class, which we call labor, it's going to be a question first approach. We're going to start with a given question. We're going to exhaustively choose what is the question is going to be about, And based on that, we're going to try to figure out how do you get the weakest possible assumptions to answer that question. And you will see, this is something that is going to be, I guess, complicated for you to know now, but as you see throughout, if you take that course, you'll see that the assumptions are often not nested. You can choose one set of assumptions, or you can choose another set of assumptions, like a Venn diagram. And in some situations, the assumptions might be more plausible in one case versus another. But oftentimes you see in that course what's going to happen a lot more of that feedback loop that I was talking about, where you realize, wow, that question that I really wanted to answer turns out to yield assumptions that they're stupid. They're just too hard. Nobody's going to ever believe those assumptions. So how do you now navigate this trade-off between perhaps asking a question that is a little bit less important, but then you get to make assumptions that are weaker? Does that make sense? You can think, the way to think about this is that you think about a frontier between the trade-off between you ask in one extreme you have the most important question possible, but then you have a very strong assumption. And in the other case, you have the least strong assumption, the weakest possible assumption, but perhaps a not so interesting question. How do you navigate this whole frontier, right? As close as possible to the whole frontier. So that's going to be what I plan to do, not only in the other course, which is more question based, but is also in this course. It's just that in this course, we're going to focus primarily on randomization. Okay. But as you will see, a lot of that's going to happen in this course is that I'm going to, for you to to develop the maturity to be more of a producer of knowledge, producer of knowledge in causal research, I need you to uh, plant a flag every time you're making an assumption, even though the person is making an assumption without saying, I made this assumption. So oftentimes I'm going to state more explicitly, this is an assumption, because it's going to be particularly useful for you as a producer of knowledge, because when a paper goes and does something and they do not state necessarily all their assumptions, here lies an opportunity for you to write a new paper, right? And sometimes if you think that assumption is too strong, it might give you more ability to understand, to motivate yourself or motivate the reader of your papers why you don't want to go in a particular route. Why do you want to go with a different kind of strategy? Does that make sense? Okay. So the key idea that I will start telling you about is the idea that many of you might think that randomization is the way to approach causal questions. And it's, of course, a way. But I hope by now you start realizing that this is not reality. Most causal questions we ask in a daily basis, you do not you do not get good answers based on randomization. Like, for instance, think about literally almost 100% of engineering. In almost 100% of engineering, what they do is that they have a controlled environment and they switch something and they see what happens. If what happens is satisfactory, they keep that switch, they keep that thing. If it's not satisfactory, they change something, do something else. What what they do not do is they don't randomly assign 50 plants in the treatment group and 50 plants in the control group, and they switch in the treatment group and they don't switch in the control group. They don't do that. This is how the real world, how people, most of science, what we do is experiments. Experiments is a much broader category than randomized experiments. You see my point? If I go and punch him and he gets hurt, we all are going to attribute the cause of that punch as the cause of him getting hurt as me punching. Right? We don't need 50 Gregs punching him in the treatment group and 50 Gregs not punching him, a person like him in the control group, for us to understand that the reason he's hurt is because I punch him, right? we- Essentially, effectively what we do in our brains, we do it all the time. Like, for instance, think about how a baby figures out how to move from here to here. What they're doing in their brain is that they're doing a bunch of experiments, not randomized experiments, experiments in their synapses about certain things to go this way. But if you were to measure how their arm goes, sometimes it goes there when he wants to go here. Sometimes it goes there when he wants to go there. Over time, they get feedback, enough feedback, they start realizing, when I do this, I go this way, and so on. That's how we learn how to walk. That's how we learn how to do things in life. That's how we learn things. We learn through causal inference. And again, I hope you understand that when that learning happens, nobody's randomizing things. We're learning things from basic, obvious feedback based on comparison. When a person is playing tennis and he's doing that, and if they get feedback that, oh, that went out, that went in, that's how they learn to improve. They don't get 50 people doing that particular game and 50 other people not doing the opposite game so that they learn. That's not how learning happens for most cases. It is true that randomization has a very important, it shows up very importantly in economics and public policy in general. And we're going to talk quite a bit about its place in it. But for you to start thinking that that's it, that's how we go after causality, I need to step back to you for you to start understanding, not as a consumer, to be more than an independent thinker, to understand that that's not usually how people go after causal effects at all, right? That's how we learn about causal effects in our lives. You probably, if you ask yourself about, like, let me ask you a question. Let's say that you have a son who currently has a disease and you need to figure out whether he should take a medicine. How would you go about finding the answer? Would you necessarily go through an experiment? Let's say you have the very well published paper on the use of the medicine. It's possible that that experiment will tell you a lot of useful information, right? Well, what if your son has some pre-existing conditions? Uh, Maybe it could be useful for you to figure out whether, based on the side effects that your son might have, you could be using information from other sources besides that paper, right? Because that paper will get you something like an average effect of a person that you don't even know these people. It might match well with your son, but as you know, the causal effect of the average person is not the same as the average effect, right? So even if your son looks like the average, it might be that the average effect, the estimate is going to be very different, right? All those kinds of things could be happening. I'm just trying to open your mind to the idea that experiments, they're not even, and I'm going to tell you in a few slides, they're not even going to be necessarily the best approach. Like if you have an experiment, it's not going to even the best approach for you to answer a question. Okay? Well, let's go a little further in the class so that you understand. First, we need to ask, what is a causal question? And of course, causal questions come disguised in all kinds of shapes, right? The most obvious one would be to say, like, what is the causal effect of a given variable? We call that a treatment variable, calling that D, on Y. So, what is the effect of taking an aspirin on having a headache? Like, for instance, think about, you measure whether you take an aspirin right now and whether you have a headache an hour from now, right? That would be, D would be an indicator about whether you took an aspirin, and Y will be an indicator for whether you have, or maybe an outcome of how intense is your headache an hour from now, right? That would be a causal question that you could ask there. Another causal question would be, what's the effect of a training program on employment of that person who got trained? These are, this is kind of obvious ways to ask a causal question, but it turns out that sometimes causal questions come a little bit disguised. Like, for instance, is brushing teeth good for you? What exactly what exactly do you mean is brushing teeth is the D, and then what do you mean by good? You might think about, oh, maybe your health, your overall health, or your health, your teeth health, or maybe your happiness. You might have to define what Y must be there by good, right? And then you ask the causal, what is the causal effect of brushing teeth? Perhaps brushing teeth will be whether you brush teeth 3 times a day, 2 times a day, 1 times a day, or 0 times a day, or something like that. And the why will be what happens with the health of your teeth a month from now, right? You have to define those things, but essentially, these are essentially causal questions that sometimes come disguised as something like, is brushing teeth good for you? Sometimes the question is a little bit more complicated, like what are the returns to education? Like, for instance, if a person goes to college versus if they otherwise don't go to college, what happens with their outcome? You can think about outcomes like earnings. You can think about their outcome as happiness. You can think about the outcome. There are papers that show even as outcome divorce rates. or some other measures of social economic characteristics. Okay, so you basically you could ask all kinds of questions like that. But then there are questions that are really disguised, but there are still causal questions. Like, is there racial discrimination in the labor market? So if you think about labor market, you can think about if you compare, you want to ask the causal effect of race per se on the earnings offer, the offers of earnings, or whether you get an employment or something like that, right? You get ideally you would get a person that is identical to each other in all the kinds of skills that the employer might perceive as important for them. The only difference will be the race, and you see whether race has any impact on whether that employer offers a job or not, or whether that employer conditioning offer on offering a job, whether they give a higher salary for one race versus the other. Does that make sense? But that's a racial causal effect that you are after there when you ask. But sometimes they sometimes call discrimination, which is a very different expression. Does that make sense? And how much parents value school quality. Again, you have a measure of school quality, maybe the average test score of that school in an overall statewide measure of test score, and then you measure what will be the willingness to pay of parents for going to one standard deviation higher school versus not, right? And if you're able to measure that, you can measure the outcome will be the willingness to pay. The D will be the test score measure that we just talked about. Does that make sense? And you can measure this as a causal effect. And of course, there are many other ways to measure this causal effect. Turns out most of the literature don't try to measure that. They try to measure in different ways. They look at how house prices in school districts where the parents tend to send their kids to those school districts that have better schools in terms of measurable notions of school quality, whether they pay higher price for it, because that would, in principle, elicit some information about their higher demand for going to higher school quality places. Of course, we need to compare the fact that those neighbors are not only different from each other, only because of school quality, they have to be different, probably because of other things. That's a different concept. The question per se will be how much people will be willing to pay the higher price for higher school quality, right? And if you think about it, any why question ends up being essentially a causal question. A why question turns out to be a very imprecise question because if you think about it, any why question essentially is never telling you what is the counterfactual. Like for instance, why did we lose? Are you all into football? Why did we lose the game against Ole Miss in in the in the in the last game that we lost in the game last year in the football game? There are several reasons why we lost it. Maybe one touchdown could have happened, but it didn't. Maybe one touchdown that they scored would not happen, and they did. There are several different. Like, why did the basketball team won? Maybe because a particular player fumbled or took out or lost the ball, or maybe because another player scored when the other team when he or she wouldn't score otherwise, and so on. Right? There are lots of reasons why you can think about a why question. The point here is that you need to define what the counterfactual is. Otherwise, you you don't know. Like for instance, why did this fall down? Interrogating. That is one potential answer. But what you did in your mind when you did that was that you compare two counterfactuals: the counterfactual of Greg holding with the counterfactual of Greg dropping. That's your answer. I could have answered the following question: the reason this fell down is because we have gravity. And then the comparison would be Greg dropping, that's why of one there, versus Greg dropping on space. You will not have drop, right? Right. The answer for that question would be gravity. You see what I mean? Different counterfactuals lead to different answers of why. And if you are not precise enough about this, and the fact that all humans tend to think about one specific uh, counterfactual and not all the other possible counterfactuals, I think it's a little bit telling about how we as society tend to, in all the needle haystack, which all the ideas out there are in the world, that you can pick up. Ideally, you want to pick up the needles and not the haystack. Haystack would be bad ideas. Needle would be good ideas. The fact that, objectively speaking, there are two potentially correct ideas, answers to that question, and we all went for the first needle and never to the second one, it should be a little bit telling about the value of being an independent thinker. That there is a second answer out there. You just do not pick up enough, right? And that's the value of precision. And that's exactly the goal of why we are going to set up this course between Carol and I, because Carol has a much higher comparative advantage of being fully precise on the deduction process. And I have a comparative advantage of being precise on this loop that we talked about. Does that make sense? Any question thus far?
Sticking with the randomization and then talk about. So all the examples like you hitting a tennis ball or moving your arms, it's more indicating a before and after kind of thing, a feedback thing. And you say 50 people don't need to participate, or you're trying to say duty need not be the control entry to specify the thing. So, but the causal inference that we studied, it I believe had the three people, control group, and we established a correlation, right? So all you're trying to say is just about randomization.
Okay. What I'm trying to say is that we actually get causal interpretation out of comparisons. And one specific kind of comparison we can make is through randomization. But another comparison we make is through other kinds of assumptions that do not involve randomization. Like, for instance, what you're saying, so let's say that we look at the counterfactual that he was talking about. We are on planet Earth, we're holding that constant, dragging planet Earth, dropping versus dragging planet Earth, not drop. We're holding close to the environment, but we are just, the D there will be whether I drop or not, right? So essentially, let's say that we're asking this question retrospective, like, why did that drop? So we do observe the fact that it dropped. So we do observe what we call, say, in this case, let me give you some notation. We do observe the Y1. So this is the potential outcome. What happens when Greg took it up? Yeah, like are no longer holding the pen. That's why Y1, which is dropped. Now, if we think about the y of 0 defined in the way he defined, which is let's hold constant the environment, let's hold constant that we are on planet Earth, same amount of gravity, but now I held up, right? That last second, which I would have dropped, I instead held. That is something that I don't know, correct? I wouldn't know y of 0 because I'm asking this question retrospectively. I don't yet know. I am not certain that had I stayed one more second holding that one, it would not have dropped. But I can predict very well because I have observed in the last few 10 seconds before I took it out, I observed them in steady state. That pen was there for 10 seconds before I dropped, right? So you predict very well, you can forecast that probably the Y of 0 is probably going to be staying there if I held it, right? But that was a prediction you did. You did a prediction to estimate this guy here. And then you compare the causal effect based on that, right? I could, like I said, I could have thought about a different kind of Y of 0, which is now I'm not holding constant the environment anymore. I'm holding constant the fact that D is no longer what I just defined, which is dropping or not dropping. The D is whether you are in planet Earth versus in the space. And now the answer to that why question will be a completely different one. It will be because of gravity. Again, it will be the answer will be because of planet Earth versus planet space. And then if I keep asking a bunch of questions, I find out that it's because of gravity and not because of all the attributes that planet Earth has that space doesn't have, or vice versa. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's usually how we go after causal inference. But the key point here for now is for you to understand that yes, randomization is going to be one way to go after the truth after a given causal question. But if you force yourself to only think through questions that can only be answerable through randomization, you will realize there are many very interesting questions, or are the most interesting questions. You just cannot do that, or certainly you will be at least inefficient to do so, let alone sometimes not ethical. You don't have ethical grounds to do so, or sometimes it's impossible to do so. Like I just gave you the example when I was talking before about engineering. You will see why engineers find out that it's much easier, instead of randomizing things in many situations, they find it's much easier to have a fully controlled environment where they can predict the y of zero or the y of one, for the matter, very precisely, because they have full control of that environment. Why most of physics do that? They create a controlled environment and they can experiment things without randomization. Most of science does obtain causal inference, and they do not do randomization. It's useful for us to understand this because they will be interesting questions that we can go after without randomization that we wouldn't be able to go after with randomization. And that's the kind of blind spot that is useful for you all to know here, especially because you could find an opportunity for you to write an interesting paper to ask the real question that people care about, and not necessarily the question that people were able to answer. Because some of these people, they might know only those tools, the randomization tools. So they might ask only the questions that they can answer, right? Okay, so this goes back to the notation I was talking about. D will be the treatment variable, and I'm just simplifying here. Later, I'm going to talk about D as not being binary, but for now, just think about D being 0 or 1. Think about a given causal question like, what is the causal effect of going to college on your earnings, let's say? Think about outcome as earnings at age 40. Again, there's lots of different ways I could measure the outcome. Could measure the outcome as earnings right after college, but that will be a very bad measure, right? Because most of you earn very less, much less than you would have earned in the markets if you were paid right now. It's just that you are still investing in your career. So you need to get an age that is sufficiently after grad school so that you can actually see the full return of that education you got. You could ask, instead of the specific earnings at age 40, you could ask perhaps the present value of all your earnings in your whole career. All these kinds of questions in principle, you could ask different kinds of outcomes, right? But D here will be whether you go to college. Again, there are lots of nuance here. There's lots of interesting possible questions you could ask. You could define not D as college, but college in a specific major, college in a specific major and a specific institution, like specific university and so on. Okay? But for now, let's just simplify. Let's zoom out and think about the idea of the causal effect of going to college. And the key idea, like I was discussing, is that there are essentially two potential outcomes. These are not things that we're not necessarily observing. This is the potential outcome, which is what would have been your earnings. Why IO1 in this case will be what would have been your earnings of individual I of a given person if you were to go to have taken college, versus what would be the earnings of an individual I if you were to not take college. Again, your earnings at age 40 in this example. Does that make sense? And like I said, there are two ways that you can think about here. Like I said before, the tendency is for us to think that we observe one thing and not the other. Like for instance, if you're looking at a person, a 40-year-old, like I'm 47, so a person, me, like what is the return of Greg having gone to college? I do observe the wide eye of one for me, right? But I, of course, do not observe this path that I could have taken, right? So I had to predict exactly like the example we said before. That's a retrospective question. I observe one of the Y eyes, but I do not know the other Y eye. And as you know, you probably have heard the concept that the fundamental problem of causality is that you only observe one but not the other. The way I would pose it, again, that's imprecise. The way I would pose it about the fundamental problem of causality is that you cannot observe both of them together. Because like I said, in a prospective question, you don't observe YI of 1 liter. I imagine you're asking right now, a person who is about to go to college, will he or she, what will be their return to college? You don't know their yi of 1, and you don't know their yi of 0 either. This is the future, right? So in principle, you have to predict both of them. Does that make sense? But one thing for sure it happens, and that's the fundamental problem of causality, is that you can never observe both, right? Together. Does that make sense? Because as far as we know, we cannot go back in time and have the opposite path, right? Now, the classic solution, that's the solution that we're going to try to focus on right now. We're going to focus on where we can a lot more this assumption inside these classes. But the classic solution that you might think about will be, okay, so we all know that these kinds of people that have college and the kinds of people that don't have college, they are not necessarily the same type of people. So just making a simple comparison between their earnings among the people with college versus among the people without college may not tell you exactly the true causal effect. The classic idea that correlation is not the same as causation, right? So that the simple solution to the problem that we usually think about is the idea of randomizing the college staffs. So let's say that you somehow random assign individuals to different groups based on that definition, based on the definition of P, and some people go to college while other people don't go to college, but they're otherwise the distribution of types on one side and distribution of types on the other side is identical because you randomize, right? And then you can compare their earnings. Now, I think everybody in this room, you have based on your 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 career up until now, and even if not, based on what we just discussed up until now, I think you would know that the answer to the question, is that the only possible solution, that randomization? I think you all have agreed here with me that that's not the only possible solution to go after that causal question, right? In principle, you can figure out perhaps ways to make other kinds of comparisons. Ideally, you might want to ask the question, okay, so can I come up with a way to say that, okay, all the attributes that affect earnings of these two individuals are identical, except one did go to college and the other did not go to college. So maybe we can compare their earnings then. Yeah. Maybe you can find a way to do that. Everybody, I think, is at this point are okay with the answer no to the question, is that the only possible solution? But by the end of the class today, my hope is to actually provide a lot more maturity in the way you answer the next question, which is that the best solution? Because if you are like me, how I learned in grad school, the answer from you would have been yes. Is that the best solution? Yes. If you have that solution, if you have, if you are able to do randomization, then just do it. It's the best possible way to answer that question. Uh, and there's some truth to that, but the problem here is the meaning of the word best. Okay. As you will see, what you mean by best is a different thing because there will be some hidden assumptions. And those hidden assumptions are more likely to happen oftentimes when you do randomization. So you think you are doing a all else constant comparison and you are not. Does that make sense? So let's go over that to try to understand what is happening. First, let's actually ask the real question, which is, what do you really care about? I mean, supposedly we're doing science for people to learn about something, right? Suppose there's going to be somebody who's going to read our paper, get that information they got for a paper, and make a decision. That person could be a policymaker, that person could be a parent sending their kid to college or not, deciding whether to send the kid to college or not. Somebody's going to have to make a decision. Otherwise, that paper is going to live forever and ever as a useless paper where people are supposedly learning, perhaps learning, but they will never, eventually, that learning will never trigger any kind of thing that shows up in the world, as in some behavior. So let's just talk about what are the kinds of possible questions that you could be caring about. Okay. The first one will be the obvious questions like, I care about a specific person. I want to ask the causal effect of that person I, that specific person I. What is the yi of 1 versus the yi of 0 of that specific person y? And like I said before, it could be a retrospective question or it could be a prospective question. Probably you might argue that the most likely scenario for that question to be useful at all would be a prospective question, right? I hope by now you start understanding that All textbooks, when they write the fundamental problem of causality as saying you observe one Y and not the other, they're essentially implicitly asking a retrospective question. I hope by now you'll start realizing, but wait. The most interesting question that you really care about is probably a prospective question, right? Right. So think about, for instance, whenever you go and find, if you look at the Opportunity Insights website, where there are lots of very good researchers that go after causal effects, and that's why they make really good assumptions on causality. So you really can believe that they are estimating causal effects, but they go and estimate based on data from people of my age, how they grew up in different neighborhoods when they were 10-year-olds in the United States. They found out that some people, some neighborhoods, when these kinds of kids that grew up in certain neighborhoods, they got better in terms of their percentile of income, much more than some other kids that grew up in different kinds of neighborhoods, right? And then the tendency is for you to start to use that information and say, okay, this means that if I send my kid now to that neighbor, if I go and move to that neighbor, my kids are going to be better off compared to this average neighborhood or these alternative neighbors that could have grown. I hope by now, based on the way I pose the questions, based on the way I pose the hidden assumptions, you understand that the question that you really care about is a prospective question. And the question that they answered was a retrospective question. And it's entirely possible that the specific attributes of the neighborhood that showed up when I was being raised in that neighborhood, when I was 10 years old, like 30 years ago, those attributes are not stable. They are no longer the same attributes that show up in the neighborhood right now when a person, unbeknownst to them, they are going to send their kid to that neighborhood because that neighborhood is so good. It's possible that it's no longer as good, right? Or maybe it can be more complicated. Or maybe the issue will be with the kind of parental style that the cohort of mine I was being raised at the time, maybe some tough luck, something like that. That environment interacted really well with that kind of parental style. And now the parental style has changed. And maybe that environment doesn't interact well with that parental style. And this is why you may send the kid to the same neighborhood and it doesn't work nearly as well as you were expecting it to work. Does that make sense? All those things are in principle possible. The point here is I do not want to say that is not happening. What I want to say here is that whoever writes this, you need to be aware of those assumptions so that when you report those assumptions to whoever wants to make decisions, they are aware of the additional assumptions they need to make if they are to do prospective decisions. Yes.
So if those effects evolve over time, then what would the impact of that study be? Uh, what would the implications be?
Yeah. So the short answer to you is that we don't know, right? The truth is you want to do some kind of extrapolation of something, and the true thing you want, which is what is the effect of personal I. Let's say I want to send my kid right now to this neighbor. I do know something else. I do know some measure, uh, some kind of measure of the average person in that neighborhood. But this is an average of a very different sample. This is a sample of people with very different culture 30 years ago in that neighborhood. And that neighborhood perhaps is very different 30 years, was that very different 30 years ago versus now. So I do observe that. And let's say that they do go after a causal effect, they do observe that as well. They do observe the average neighbor or some any random allocation you could go to any kind of neighbor, right? And they realize, well, clearly that specific neighbor, let's talk about neighborhood J, a specific neighborhood in Atlanta, this has a huge effect. This is very high, this red uh, uh, quantity there. From there to extrapolate that that specific blue quantity is high, there are assumptions. Some of these assumptions may make sense, others may not. And this is the hidden curriculum part that we talked about. That's exactly where you need to impose some structure and be explicit about what is the structure you're imposing in order to do that extrapolation. I can even go, so I just chose a specific question that perhaps is harder for you to believe this assumption of that extrapolation. But think about one assumption that is a little bit easier for you to extrapolate, but people don't talk about that as an assumption, right? They usually think about, for instance, when you compare schools like value added of teachers. Then you look at the value added of teachers and you see, or you see like which school is the best school in terms of graduation rate. Even you look at US News um, rankings, US News rankings for universities, right? What effectively they do is that they're doing a retrospective question. Let's say that for the sake of argument, you're making a causal pointer. Because you know that this is not necessarily causal pointer, but let's say for the sake of argument, you were to agree that this is a causal effect. Like the Harvard being top number one means Harvard is the best school there. That was for that had, or imagine, even if you measure, like let's say that you measure not in terms of rankings of people's perception of the school, but you actually measure value add. Something like you might find that a specific university, say University of Georgia, had the highest value added because they measured just before versus just after they graduated. Just before they entered versus just after they graduated, and the person who proved the best, the average person who went to college 4 years ago. Still, these are people that went to college 4 years ago. And now the reason why you might want to use that information is because you might want to send your kid now, not 4 years ago. So if you were to send your kid 4 years ago, that would be very good information. That would still be a little bit bad information because you're still talking about the average person who comes in at UGA and not necessarily your specific kid, right? But still, it's probably much better because to the extent that UGA may change its attributes over time, uh, it's possible that UGA is no longer as good or is even better than 4 years ago. So you need to have that kind of information. Again, this happens on a daily basis with, I guess, everybody here. Like, for instance, imagine if you have, uh, like I said before, a disease. Are you going to really trust that whatever data they get to do an actual randomization get you exactly what you want? Or you're going to try to obtain more attributes, more information about what is the context of that paper that got you that information. And you're going to start perhaps using even more information. You're going to might find useful information coming from Reddit or websites like that, that perhaps they might give you something that is much less likely to be actually causal because they will tell you about, oh, my perception is that when I took the medicine, I developed a rash. You see it. This is not probably well measured. You know how we make mistakes. Psychology has given us a lot of to understand about the bias of human mind, right? So we know how our perception of reality is not necessarily reality. So it's possible that there are certain things that are genuinely bad about that information in Reddit. And yet, with the context of that Reddit comment, you might be able to match certain pre-existing conditions you have versus that person that wrote that comment has. So maybe that information could be relevant for you for whether you should take the medicine or not. And certainly that pre-existing condition, you might not have at all that information in the experiments. You see, all these kinds of things are part of the trade-off for any decision maker of any paper or any person who needs to make a decision in their life. And as you see, we as producers of one important aspect of that public record, which are papers, we need to be aware of the fact that yes, we are competing against Reddit articles too. 20 years from now, somebody's going to prompt a question. It's going to say, I need to send my kid to somewhere, to school and so on. What should I do? And an AI system may do a weighted average of several information out there. And in principle, they may want to put a lot more weight on the information that comes from your paper, which has this amazing random experiment. But because you do not report enough context about who were in your sample, you do not report enough context about effects could be different across people and things like that, they would naturally overload the weight on that article from Reddit that talks a lot about, oh, when I send my kid was used to be shy, match. Let's say that your kid is shy. My kid is from Texas, match. My kid is also from Texas, and so on. It started matching, and then suddenly my kid had a great experience in that college. And then you will say, well, what do you think AI is going to do? AI is in equilibrium more likely to put a lot more weight on that in a world where whatever we produce, even if it's causal, is not quite a perfect match to that prompt. And maybe you're going to prompt things in a very like non-identifiable way. And you're going to say, is college good for, is college good for earnings? And then AI is going to tell you, well, the evidence suggests that yes. And then it's going to probably put a lot more weight on your answer. But then you're going to say, but wait, let me tell a little bit about myself. Or maybe the AI will already have that information coming from all sensors that your watch already has. Maybe they will already have that information, and you're gonna essentially load a lot more information from you in that prompt, even though you didn't prompt it about it. And then it's possible that if we are producing information that is not as contextual as a lot of other information out there, even though that other kind of information sucks in terms of causal inference, it's possible that we're going to end up waiting a lot more of that. So I think we as society, and we in particular in academia, we should be concerned about the degrading quality of information, in particular when we talk about causal effects. And I mean, in principle, if you believe you're truly going after a causal effect, and perhaps Reddit articles might not, it's possible that somebody gets killed because of a side effect that wouldn't get killed otherwise, or things like that, right? I mean, we're talking about quick cases like college, the return to college, which might not be as catastrophic, but take a much more complicated problem like mental health issues, where mental health issues, the kind of field is full of heterogeneous treatment effects. It's really hard to understand the effect of one person versus another person. The average almost tells you nothing about what is the true effect for a given person. That becomes really complicated, and that can have tremendous impact on well-being if we don't understand, don't have this independent thinking with. And that's exactly, as you see, that's part why I wanted to record this, because I think we can build a better science by providing better output out there in terms of causal inference. Okay, so going back to this point, this relates to his question. We teach might get to some kind of average effect. If you do that kind of randomization I was talking about, you get to this kind of average treatment effect, which is the average across all individuals that, right? The average of the effects across all those individuals in the population. That's what we are essentially targeting if we do that kind of randomization of college. Now, the question is, why should we care about the average as this causal object? I kind of hinted already that not necessarily you care about, right? Especially in depending on the questions. If you are asking a question that you believe you had this prior, that there is very little reason to believe that there's a lot of heterogeneous effects, maybe you don't care. Average is good enough, right? Because if you think about it, if the heterogeneous effects are distributed like that, maybe the average will tell you a lot of information. But if the heterogeneous effects are distributed like that, if you know the average, what about people here? What about people here? You're giving them very little information, right? And that is exactly what uh, triggers. This is a conjecture I have, by the way. This is not something I know for a fact, but I conjecture that's what triggers in problems where there's a lot of heterogeneous effect. That's what triggers a lot of people to seek things that you and I might call woo-woo, they're not called science. Because essentially our approach to go after causal effects are so ingrained into averages that if a person goes if a person takes the regular medicine that a physician tells you to, and it doesn't work for them, and they realize that the physician can never really tap into what you really need. And then you start going into things that an outsider might look at as like, why are you doing this? Maybe because currently we don't yet have a technology to answer the question for that kind of person. Because that person might be too much in the upper tail in terms of how their effect is, or too much in the lower tail of how their effect is. And this might not matter at all if you break your arm, because heterogeneous effects are very tight there. But this matters a lot if you have a problem like an ADHD or something like that. See, like some other issue like that. So that is why we are currently not responding, not providing enough information for these people to engage with science. That's my conjecture. And that is in part why I want to teach courses that try to step back and try to go after the real question that people care about, which might be this: what is the effect of taking a medicine for a person who's in their upper tail or something like that, right? Okay, so let me go further in this. Why isn't the average causal effect enough, really? So here are several questions that I'm posing that a potential policymaker might care about. What is the fraction of individuals who benefit from the treatment? You can think about treatment being college, or you can think about the treatment being that particular medicine, right? Or what is the fraction that are harmed? Like, for instance, FDA cares a lot about this question. They usually, what do you call the Hippocrates oath? What's it called? The name of the oath? Where you do no harm in medicine, right? This idea here is that you want to try to provide only medicine that does not create harm. So if you get the average, do you really know about the answer for that question? You don't. You really don't. If you only estimate the average, officially you really cannot tell you whether it harms somebody or not. You certainly don't know what fraction of individuals benefit. Who should receive the treatment? Like, for instance, as you know, often treatment is costly. College is definitely costly. So it's not necessarily beneficial. It has to be beneficial beyond the cost for you to even invest in that. So who should receive the treatment? You don't know. With the average alone, you really don't know. What is the welfare effect of a policy? Return to school is an obvious case, right? If you make $30,000 and the return to school is 20,000, because welfare, or you think about utility, tends to be concave, $20,000 for a person who would make $30,000 anyway, this is a lot of money. But let's say that a person would have made $200,000 and now he or she is making 20 additional $1,000. That's much less, right? That's a 10% increase from a person who already makes 200,000. So the utility doesn't go up nearly as much with the last example that in the first example. Are you seeing my point? And that's matter, right? Because if you think about it, that's exactly the point. In which conditions would the average matter? Only when the function of the estimates that you care about happens to be a linear function. Because you probably remember that the average of a linear function is the linear function of the average. Remember that? So by definition, a nonlinear function is not a is a nonlinear operator. So the average, if you get the average, it's going to be very little information really about what you care about, right? So now it's really like I ask you, whenever we're all reporting in papers averages, which is fine because this is the best we can do. But have you been in a situation where you read a paper and you, the person who wants to make a decision based on whatever that paper gives you, that person, you really want to just put a linear operator on that coefficient and just say, that's what I care about. I want to maximize that linear operator. That it's really a difficult. I just gave you 5 different questions that happens to not be a linear operator, right? So in case of earnings, that's kind of obvious because we might care much more about return to schooling, return to college for people that have low levels of education and therefore they would have made very little money versus people that have higher levels of education, whose parents have higher level education, have different kinds of social networks that would have made probably more money regardless. You see? Yes.
So would you come down would it come down to just what you said? Like just like his parents is give the treatment and see. what happened and then decide. So what would be the way forward for this problem?
So that is the whole course, right? What would be the way forward? The way forward is that the first thing, the way forward is whenever you report your results, you need to be, you need to transmit that awareness that you currently have, which is this is an average. So whenever you are using this information, you better understand that that's an average. So if you are making a decision about the average person, you even if you're making a decision about the average person, you could be wrong. Because like I said, the average effect is different. It may be different from the effect of the average person, right? So that matters. But I'm gonna go further than that. Give me a few slides because I'm gonna go further than that because that is the key idea that you start realizing. You start realizing that there is a reason why we, as academics, we don't talk much about that. Because imagine if the best I could do is to answer a question. Imagine, for instance, I am in the business of create or working on a company, and I create a product that doesn't work very well or is not very useful. People will not pay me much for my product, right? Now imagine that I'm in the business of, I'm an academic, I'm a business of providing some kind of causal estimates. But let's say that now I estimate something which is an average effect, and you just heard me saying that maybe that information is useless, or perhaps not useless, but it is much less useful than people think it is. What am I saying to you? I'm essentially saying to you that perhaps people that do causal inference are not providing a product that is as useful as they may be reporting to be. Do you think it's helpful for me to say that? It's clearly not, right? People are going to be paying me less to provide half answers if I am truly honest about how I conceive my answers to be, which is not very useful. So you might expect, think like an economist that day in terms of incentives. You might expect in a world like that, there's a little bit of a self-serving bias here on the kinds of information that are going to show up in our papers are going to be informations there's going to be almost like a mediocrity pact that we all inside academic will make, which is, yeah, I guess let's call constant treatment effects. Read your textbooks. Most of the assumptions there, let's assume constant treatment effects. Everything I just said is no longer relevant if you have constant treatment effects. It doesn't matter this thing anymore, right? Because under constant treatment effects, the average is the same as beta I. So all my problems I just raised to you is no longer relevant. Again, there are certain questions that assumption perhaps might not be the end of the world. But like I've been saying to you, it also means that the kinds of papers that could have existed if we were all honest about it, we would have had more incentives to write papers about mental health issues, about chronic pain, about things that are currently a lot of people suffering about, and we can all write papers about it because the assumption of constant treatment effects in those scenarios are laughable, right? And what I mean here is if the moment you start having more maturity to start thinking as a producer of knowledge, is going to start realizing that that is an opportunity here for you. Because there are certain ideas out there that don't show up in papers. That don't show up in papers because there are some hidden assumptions that we all make. And the nice thing about scientists in general economics too is that honestly, I don't think there's intention in that. Some of them are probably, most of them, I would say, they don't even have noticed these issues. But that's the good news for you because the moment you point them out, it's your idea. It's you write your paper about it. And and one thing I've noticed in my career is that once you point out a problem, the tendency is for these people to not be defensive at all. They like it. They think this is a good idea because they had never had the intention of hiding those assumptions. They only wanted to do the best they can, but they only took first year, second year PhD econometrics. They never talked to them about those hidden assumptions. As you see, look at those, what the textbooks talk. Most of the textbooks are never speaking about those issues, which is why I think we wanted to record this so that we can percolate information like that more to the public record. But the key idea here is there are, you will make hidden assumptions. My suggestion is make them explicit as a writer. And because the moment you make it explicit, you have the advantage of being the first person to actually put truly your hands in the table. Because what I've been saying here is that it appears that a person does a random experiment is showing their hands at the table, when in fact they might think they are putting their hands at the table, but they are estimating something that nobody really wanted to ask in the first place. The only person who wanted to ask that person would be a person who is contemplating, let me put a linear operator on that average that you want to estimate. Again, I've been thinking quite a bit about this. Try to find a linear operator there. It's really hard, really hard. This goes back to questions that we all ask in academia, right? Like, for instance, we all go to take a plane and we sort of trust the pilot of the plane to land well, right? Because somehow we believe that that person has enough skills to do that. If you ask most economists, would you do the equivalent to a paper based on the rigor of causality that those papers came up with? Like, do you trust them like a pilot? Like, for instance, let's say that you need to trust your life out of taking a medicine coming from one effect that gets published in the best journal in our profession. Would you do that? And my guess is that most people will say, not as much as in the case of the pilots. And I think that's telling for us. It's telling for us that this is a good reality check for us to understand that perhaps we all are part of that mediocrity pact that we talked about. And we somehow have an intuition about. And I think it's time for us to wake up. That's basically it. To be honest, I really do not impute intention because I have met enough of these people. And remember, as you know, intention means a causal effect, right? And if anything, I really believe that these people they want to go after the truth. And most of these people really want to go after the truth. They just never thought much about these kinds of blind spots, which is natural that some people don't think because, as we were discussing earlier today, right? If you are being rewarded or punished for your whole life based on questions that never had hidden assumptions, the questions you always knew that was a right question, a right answer, all those things through all your whole career, these are really good students. All of us we grew out to be very good students in our schools and so on. So we are selected to be very good people at simplified notions of reality. And we're not necessarily now what we are suggesting here is that whenever you go from a consumer to a producer, it's almost like you need to have this other orthogonal skill, which is to think about what is hidden. And it's hard. It's something that we're all trying to work together on. But we are not necessarily selected to be the kind of people that are very good at this. By we, I mean literally everybody in academia. When we're perhaps good at certain aspects of it, but not necessarily very good at things and noticing things that are beyond what your teacher throughout your whole career would know, right? What your teacher would know is what he or she calls right or wrong. Okay, so think about this example, for instance. Think about just two scenarios. These are two parallel scenarios of returns to school. You have in scenario one here, you have two types of people. They, if they didn't go to college, one would make 40,000 and the other would make 80,000. If they were going to college, wouldn't have made one would have made 50,000 instead of 40,000, and the other would have made 90,000 instead of 80,000. So that the return to college here would be 10K for both of them, both types. Does that make sense? Now imagine a completely parallel universe where there are two completely different kinds of individuals, different types of individuals. The 40 and 80, but now they would have gone from 40 to 90, one type, and the other would have gone from 80 to 50. So here, the type 2 will be the kind of person where college would definitely harm them, right? They will give you they will reduce their salary in 30,000. But the type 1 would improve their salary in 50,000. So that on average is still, let's say that the proportion of type 1, proportion of type 2 in both scenarios are exactly 50%. So on average will be the same here. It will be 10,000, the average here, will be 10,000 the average here, right? So look at what we know. Look at what a randomization can give us. Randomization can give us the distribution of yi of 0 in both the treatment and the control group, right? The treatment and the control group are the same distribution. So we do know that yi of 0 will have, if you have enough sample in your randomization, you know that is going to be equally likely values of 40K and 80K. That's exactly what we see here and here. Does that make sense? In the treatment group, you also know the distribution will be the same. It will be 50K and 90K, 50K and 90K in both of them, right? Equally likely. We also know another thing. D is what caused those two distributions to be different from each other. You do know that. You also know the fourth thing, which is the average causal effect is 10K. All those things that I wrote in black there, you do know from randomization. What you don't know is the next thing, which is you really don't know in which of those two scenarios you are. Because you really can never compare one individual with the exact same type of individual in that randomization. You really can't. So let me give you one additional assumption you could do. If you were to make this assumption, then you'll be fine. Let's say that I say, hey, let's say that there's some kind of ranking preservation, there's some kind of ranking invariance, so that if you were, here you see there's a crossing here, right? If you were the lowest ranking type under 0, you better be the lowest ranking type under 1. This does not happen because you are the lowest ranking here and you become the highest ranking here. Does that make sense? And there's some crossing here. And here, that's true. You are the lowest here, and now under 1, you still make more, but you still make less than the other type. Does that make sense? Under rank preservation, then you can rule out scenario 2. And then you go back to scenario 1, and then you're good. Then you estimate, yes, we can make comparisons with apples and apples, and you can say that nobody got harmed in this case, right? But notice, are you guys good with that assumption? Rank preservation? It depends on the question, right? Maybe for college, it wouldn't be that bad. But let's say they were talking about an actual medicine of a problem like that has a lot of side effects. Then that rank preservation will be a bad assumption. I hope by now you start realizing the randomization, it feels like it gives you a lot, but it gives you a lot only if you make further assumptions. And those assumptions make a lot of sense, perhaps in college, and they don't make sense in mental health issues like we talked before. Does that make sense? Here's another problem. I just pretended here, I came up with an example where I pretended there are only 2 types of people. In reality, there's almost huge number of types of people. Some people go from 40 to 41,000, some people go from 40 to 42, 40 to 43, and so on, right? In that case, the kinds of assumptions, the ranking variability here that you're talking about, is a crazy assumption. Think about it. You need to now compare the lowest ranking of yi0. You need to now to match with the lowest ranking of yi1. You need to say that these are the same type of peak. The second lowest of yi0 better be the second lowest of yi1. The third lowest of yi0 has to be the same as type as the third lowest of yi1. For you to make this, by the way, for those who are interested, that's called quantile treatment effect. And that's the assumption they need to make. They make an assumption called rank invariability or rank invariance. Okay? Which essentially you cannot change the quantile depending on the treatment. If you were the quantile 30, you better continue being quantile 30 after treatment. And needless to say, you might believe that you are okay in a world where there's very little heterogeneous effects. And whenever there's a lot of heterogeneous effect, you might be a little bit more worried that this could be a good assumption, which is kind of interesting, right? You only care about quantile treatment effects when you have a lot of heterogeneous effects, because then the average doesn't tell you much. But then when you care about quantile treatment effect, you need to make the assumption that you kind of feel like you're not good with. You see, all those things are happening. If you are start using it as a producer of knowledge, you start realizing we need to make assumptions. Maybe there's an edge case there where you still care about quantile treatment effect beyond average, and you're still okay with that assumption, that's I bet you can come up with lots of interesting examples like that. But what I'm saying here is that that assumption has a lot of bite. It's perhaps a very strong assumption in several situations. The reason I wanted to tell you here, these are just examples of the kinds of problems they hit. Here's another thing you can do. You can actually go after heterogeneous effects by saying, okay, Greg, I agree that this kind of ranking variance could be a very strong assumption. But what if you think about a predetermined covariate, like the race, the gender, or some particular thing that you know will not change once I go to college versus I don't go to college? So now I can now estimate, I can try to predict those types based on those covariates. I can try to say, okay, I cannot estimate the full type, the effect per type, but I can estimate the effect per gender, or per gender and race, per gender, race, and age, per gender, age, race, and the state where you were born, and so on. I think it come up with cells like that. And now, as I'm trying to use those axes, those covariates, to predict better how these types are different from each other, I'm be more likely to estimate that, for instance, if I do those effects and I estimate what we call the conditional average treatment effect, which is the average effect among that specific subgroup of the population. Imagine if I do here. If I do it here and I find that it continues being around 10K, if I do man versus women, and both of them are 10K, men who are young versus men who are old, men who are young from Texas versus men who are young who are from Georgia. And I keep doing all this kind of breakdown, and I keep finding 10K, I'm more likely to be in scenario one, right? Versus scenario two. You see my point? You can obtain additional information. The moment you wake up and realize that no, there's something else here. Potentially, you could be talking about those two different scenarios. You can, in principle, do things. But let me show you what you can. Can you really? Let's think about that. Can you really? Because here's what you do, right? When you estimate that, you effectively have a little bit of a trade off, right? Because if you were to define cells like all the way I told you about, those cells, you need a lot more data now, because how many people are a man, white, coming from Texas with a given age, and so on. You can keep fixing yourself, right? With a very small sample. Now you need to randomize a lot more people to be able to estimate precisely the effect that you want to estimate. So there's a little bit of a trade-off in the idea that there's a practical trade-off. As X becomes more complex, on the one hand, you can better approximate this individual treatment effect, which is a great thing. But then chances are your estimator is going to be less precise. Does that make sense? But what could I do instead? Maybe what I could do is that I can impose restriction here, that the way it affects the areas doesn't affect no parameter, like I just told you, like cells. But I can just say, let's write this treatment effect as a linear function of controls. And that weakens that kind of trade-off, right? Because now I can use information from not only from I guess taxes will have to be an indicator variable, but for age, I can just use one linear coefficient of age instead of a cell per age, and that reduces the pressure for precision. Does that make sense? I hope by now you start realizing that linearity assumption somehow comes along. Somehow we are now using linearity assumption. The key point here is that why are we using those assumptions? Are we using those assumptions because they speak more about reality, or because we have an approach that we have written a lot about that is not quite as scalable towards heterogeneity, and we need to make further assumptions like constant treatment effects, ranking variance, linearity, and so on, to kind of cover the holes of the problem. The moment you start thinking about that, I hope by now you start opening up yourself up to the idea that perhaps there are that the idea of what best means is a little bit more complicated, because there are some hidden assumptions happening. So that is exactly why this course, at least my part of the course, is going to be a lot about the why assumptions are made. And you see that it's not obvious at all. You see, like, for instance, you oftentimes gotta go to target a less demanding causal object, not the quite the target that you really want in the first place. You're going to estimate, say, the average treatment effect instead of several conditional average effects, one for man versus women and so on, all those things, right? Or you might go after several conditional average effects for a simple X versus for a complex X, or you go after several conditional average effects versus the actual individual treatment effects, and so on, right? And there, as you see, there's lots of additional assumptions that are essentially happening as you're reading the paper. You're reading the paper, you might not see that them writing as this is an assumption, but they might write in their introduction, this is what I care about. When in fact you thought, is this really what you care about? And you realize, no, that's not quite what I care about. I care about something different, but somehow we are all making this implicit assumption that whatever you are answering can inform me about that thing that I really care about. And that extrapolation is in principle an extrapolation that requires an assumption. Of course, you can estimate homogeneous treatment effect, like constant treatment effects. In that case, you can totally extrapolate, but nobody believes that. But you can make somehow a weaker assumption, like the ranking varies or something like that. You will end up making some weaker assumption, but perhaps still too strong for your taste to go after what you really care about. So that's the kind of thing that we are going after in this course. You figure out as you're reading the introduction, what is not written in the introduction. Okay. And the same happens about the idea of imposing some structure in the heterogeneity. I told you about my examples. But the key point here is that randomization does solve a very important problem, which is the treatment assignment. But it may, in principle, add problems, or it may sometimes not add problems, but actually not whenever the person does a randomization, they are not fully reporting the degree of uncertainty about the parameter that people really care about. So I think, as I will show you in many examples in this class, sometimes there is a trade-off. Sometimes you are making weaker assumptions. We call that internal validity. We're going to talk about that in the future. We could make weaker assumptions on the treatment assignment problem, but then you are making stronger assumptions in something else. But because those stronger assumptions are somewhat more hidden than the assumption that this method is particularly good at, we might have a tendency to think that this method is really good. So we're going to go over that to understand exactly the trade-offs in both classes. Sound good? Okay, we're going to stop now.